Hello and welcome to another Jabava London game. So today I have Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces versus Benjamin Bach. And this game's a little bit older, 2016, the World Rapid Championships. We see here that Magnus Carlsen wins. I'll do the game review here real quick so we can see what accuracy percentage he had and everything. But for some reason, the names disappear once I do this. So just remember, Magnus is playing the white pieces. This game review, it says that Magnus played at 97.5% versus 89.6% by his opponent. So we see it was a pretty even game for quite a while until Magnus just starts gaining an advantage and just increases that until he wins. All right, let's dig in here. Magnus Carlsen had a 3,000 rating here in this game versus 2,550 by his opponent. And only one inaccuracy, where his opponent had 3 and 2 mistakes. So let's take a look here. I'll put on the computer analysis. That way we can see what the computer says about this game as we review it. All right, so the Jabava London is normally d4, which Magnus plays, and now knight to f6. The opponent could play d5 and then knight to f6 later. But here, Magnus plays bishop to f4 first. Sometimes in the Jabava London, you would play knight to c3. This is kind of like the normal London system as well, with an early bishop to f4. So the game continues with d5 and e3 here. This it's called, according to this computer accelerated London system, where you bring this bishop up to f4 early, then play e3, and so the bishop is outside the pawn chain. So now we have c5, a common move here in the London system, whether it's the Jabava or the regular London system. This c5 move is important because it counterattacks the center here, putting pressure on this d pawn. And of course, the e3 pawn can recapture if this c pawn captures on d4. So knight to c3. So now we're back in the Jabava London. Of course, the computer here calls this the Queen's Pawn Opening Shigorin variation. So if you're ever looking at the chess.com games database and you want to look up some Jabava London system games, you can type in Queen's Pawn Opening Shigorin variation, and it'll bring you to these games with the d4, d5, the knight on c3, which is different from the regular London. So I had a viewer ask about what is the difference if this knight is on c3 as opposed to d2 as it is in the regular London. So in the regular London system, a lot of times you'll play knight to f3 earlier and then put the other knight to d2 to back up this knight. So if the knight to f3 moves forward, the other knight could possibly jump in here to f3. And also, with a knight on d2, you're helping to cover this e4 square in case black's knight wants to jump in to e4. But what is the difference with knight to c3? Well, a knight on c3, this kind of brings this knight out to a more forward post where it's a little more active. So, a lot of times the knight can jump, well, maybe not a lot of times, but there are times when the knight can jump to b5 and then, aim for this c7 square along with the bishop. But my viewer asked, well, what do you play if the knight cannot jump up here to b5 because a6 or even c6 is played? Well, let's take a look at that. So the game continues with capture and recapture. So black does well by getting rid of his flank pawn in exchange for one of the important central pawns. So now black has 2 pawns to 1 for white, but white does have this half open e-file aiming at the king, which could be used for rooks or the queen to line up on this half open file. So now the game continues with a6. So now the knight is not going to be able to jump up here to b5 and target c7. So let's see how Magnus handles the rest of this game. And my viewer also asked, well, what do you do with this knight if it cannot jump forward here? Do you try and move it over to the king side and help with a king side attack? Well, right now I'm reading the Jabava London System book by Grandmaster Simon Williams, and some of the game examples in there, including this game, it looks like this knight, a lot of times it just stays here. Sometimes it might jump to a4 and then maybe to b6, especially if this a pawn moves up here and the knight tries to jump here and then here, and maybe the knight will move up to a5 and be able to fortify that knight on this outpost. But more often it looks like the knight jumps over here to e2, allowing this c pawn to move forward, maybe to c3 to help fortify the central pawn, since the e pawn can no longer do that. All right, moving on, we have bishop to d3. So another common move, and here Magnus maybe plays this bishop move first, one to prevent black's light squared bishop from moving outside the pawn chain. If it tries to move here, well, then you could chase it away maybe with f3, and then you start a king side attack with these pawns. And also this bishop to d3 helps keep an eye on e4, and by moving the bishop first, it gives you a little bit of time to see whether you want to move the knight to f3 or maybe even e2, possibly if this bishop comes down and tries to attack the knight. Although I did see a interesting remark by Simon Williams where he says that sometimes you shouldn't be afraid of the bishop attacking this knight and capturing, because then after the b pawn recaptures towards the center, it helps fortify the center a little bit, and it could open up the b file here, maybe for a rook or some play along that b file. All right, so Magnus's opponent, Bach, he plays knight to c6, so the computer says that's the best move, just putting some pressure on this unprotected pawn here. So Magnus responds with the knight to e2 move that I talked about. So with this knight to e2 move, the c pawn is not blocked now and can move forward, one, to keep pieces out of b4, but also to fortify this d pawn here. So bishop to g4 is played, and this move pins the knight to the queen, but that's easily taken care of by f3, where you can chase this bishop back. I assume this move was made to get the bishop outside of the pawn chain once this e pawn moves to e6, but computer says it would have been better and helped keep black with a slight edge if queen to b6 was played. So we should take a quick look at that, since the computer says that that's a more accurate move. attacking the knight and the pawn here. So what would be best? Well, it looks like apparently it would be better to just go ahead and continue with your plan of c3 here, fortifying the central pawn. And if the queen captures, well then, now the recommendation is either to play h3 to keep pieces off of this g4 square, or just f3 as well. So let's see here. The only thing, if you play an immediate knight to f3, it does get a piece developed, but then it can be attacked with this move, with bishop to g4. So let's see what happens if we play that. Does the computer continue to think that's best? Yes. So now I guess if there's an attack with bishop to g4 on that knight, the knight could jump forward and counterattack. But I don't know about that, because then, possibly this pawn could be attacked, which is protecting the c pawn. So let's see, they recommend g6, but what if we played that move? Let's see what they recommend. So now the recommendation is to just attack the queen, and this puts the game in white's favor, because you'll be able to attack the queen. Once the queen maybe captures this pawn, you can come up here and capture on b7. So let's see what the computer recommends. Queen under attack, capture this pawn, and now either rook to a1 or capture here. Let's see. Now g6 is recommended. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep into that. Let's get back to the game. So knight at c to e2, and now we have a pin on this knight, and Magnus ignores that by protecting this pawn, the central pawn, which is important. And then we have e6, allowing the other bishop to develop, and the game continues with queen moving forward here. And now white can castle on the queen side if he decides to. So the game continues with a bishop retreat, and now the knight is pinned by this bishop to g5 move. So we have that being ignored, and the bishop just retreats back, aiming here at the d3 bishop. So what does Magnus do here? Well, he ignores that attack, attacks the bishop. So we have an exchange of bishops. The knight repositions, and this is an important move here, because one of white's themes may be to attack here or cover these dark squares on c5 and e5 and try and gain control of those and use those for his advantage, by maybe in the future placing a knight up here. But at this point, if he does that, the knight would just be captured. So let's see how Magnus continues. Bishop to d6, fighting for the dark squares with this bishop. So now we have the knight putting more pressure on e5. So Magnus's opponent jumps forward here, leaving his queen under attack, but attacking Magnus's queen as well. So how does Magnus respond to this? So he captures, recapture here, and the queens are off the board. And now the king captures. And so here we have the rook capturing, allowing black's king the possibility of still castling kingside. Although now that the queens are off the board and we're heading towards an endgame, it may be better for the king to stay in the middle where it can influence the game more than if it castles into the corner. So the game continues with rook to e1, grabbing a half open file, putting more pressure on this e5 square in case the knights want to jump forward. So castling by black. Let's see if the computer has any better ideas. So one would be rook to c8, trying to help control the half open file. Another option would be a5, just gaining space, or h5, gaining space on the king side. So castling, and now Magnus jumps forward here to a4, gaining space on the queen side, and the game continues with rook grabbing the half open file, and now a5. So Magnus gains even more space here. And the game continues with rook to e8, maybe preparing the way for a future push of this pawn, maybe after f6 and then e5 in the future. So Magnus jumps forward, taking control, trying to restrict these pawns in the center, although he could be chased away here. But instead, pieces are exchanged, and we go into a rook's endgame, rook and pawn endgame here. So now f6 is played, driving the rook back. And where does Magnus go with the rook? Well, he plays the rook to e3, where it can guard this c3 pawn in case the b pawn moves forward. Also, here the rook has a little bit more scope as it can move along the third rank. So king back towards the center. So that's why maybe it would have been better for this king to stay in the center to begin with, because now time is wasted after castling to the king side and having to move back towards the center. So the game continues with Magnus moving forward here, and rook to c4. So perhaps Magnus's opponent just wanted to trade off more material and didn't want to deal with this rook putting pressure on the b pawn here and going into defense mode. So Magnus captures, pawn captures, and we have this interesting move, b3. Just giving up a pawn here. So instead of capturing, and it looks like the computer recommends capturing as best. So let's take a look at that and see. And before I get to that, let me go back a little bit further and see what the computer recommended instead of this move. So apparently this is an inaccuracy, and better would have been rook to e7, and then what should Magnus do? Looks like king up to d3 to help cover this square, rook to c6, and then now the recommendation is just g4, gaining space over here on the king side. Although now the computer seems to be a little bit unsure as to what is best. Now it's saying rook to e1, maybe to swing over and help get ready to push this pawn forward at some point. What do they recommend? g5, f4, h5, and now g5 maybe, and here rook to e8. All right, well, that is one way the game could have progressed. So now in the game, what actually happened was this rook to c4 move, an exchange of rooks here, and Magnus pushes forward. Now the opponent, Magnus's opponent, just protected the pawn, but it looks like it may have been better, according to the computer, to just capture here. So let's take a quick look at that. If there was a capture, well, now you have c4 attacking, and let's see what is recommended. Rook to d8. So putting pressure on this pawn. King over to c3, and now this pawn is under attack. King over to e7, and rook to e2. Now you can protect this row of pawns here, and stop this pawn from pushing forward, if you have to. What is recommended now? Rook to d7, and then, oh, I apologize, something happened here. I don't know if that showed up on the screen. My computer wanted to push some update. So anyway, back to the game, or what could have happened in the game. This maneuver here. Now this pawn is pretty weak. Maybe, well, let's see what they recommend. This f4 move to slow down any pawn push by this e pawn. Now they're recommending king back over to f7, so this pawn's not pinned to the king. Then g4, h6, f5, and now e5 being recommended. So although now the computer changed its mind and doesn't like that, so capture, that's more likely. Recapture, now what, g5 or g6? So if we play this, rook to b2 is being recommended. So then g4. Now the computer changed its mind again and wants h4. So you could have d5, h5, getting ready to push this pawn majority. And now king up towards the center, although it looks like it would rather that we capture there. King over to e8. Finally, the rook captures. Then h4, preparing the way to push this pawn majority. But we have c5. So the game could have gone this way. And that's probably why once we got to this point, this is what happened in the actual game. Magnus pushes and the opponent does not capture. So the game instead goes with this rook to c8 move by Magnus's opponent, Bach. And the game continues with rook to e1. So the one inaccuracy that Magnus played, it looks like preferred may have been to capture, but if we take a look at that, if we capture and the rook recaptures, now there's the possibility of just swinging over here and getting behind this pawn. So Magnus probably just didn't want to allow that. Looks like rook to e1, and then recommended is just e5 here. Okay, now I guess if this pawn does move here, Magnus could go here and threaten to capture with a check. So that's a possibility, and maybe that's why his opponent the game didn't go in this direction. All right, so what do they recommend here? e5, capture, capture, and capture. Yeah, so I don't know. That doesn't look so good. Now Magnus would just go ahead a pawn there. All right, so in the game, we had rook to e1, capture. Computer says that that is a mistake, that e5 would have been better. So that just gives up a pawn. I mean, I guess we could take a look at it, but once again, it's looking like after e5, recommended here is actually b4. Interesting. So b4. And now, what is up with this computer? I don't know why it's doing that. It recommends a move, and then when you play it, it says it's bad. So instead, computer liked that move now, saying that's best. All right. Well, that would allow capture, 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 and capture. And then you would have to protect here. But, white would have this passed pawn, I guess. So that's an advantage. Let's see here. If we go back to the actual game, rook to e1 was played. Capture. Now the rook moves over to go after this. So rook jumps forward, and now we have capture, targeting this pawn as I mentioned earlier. But the computer says that's a mistake, that it would have been better to just retreat. But now we have capture with check, king moves up, and these pawns could be dangerous here in the end game. And now this pawn is under attack. So, and capture, capture. Oh, and then now the obvious move would be king to e3, and that's what the computer recommends. But instead, Magnus moves to d3, and now the computer is saying that that's the best move. So, I don't know, I'm noticing a theme here that, unless I would really amp up the settings on this computer, and then it might take a long time to figure out what the best moves are. But the computer seems to have some issues in the end game coming up with the right moves. So the game continues with capture, and instead of capturing, this pawn just starts running up the board. So we have another capture of the pawn, and Magnus's opponent lets this pawn start running up the board, and that's going to be a problem because the game ends shortly after. So we have rook to e1. The king is cut off from the action. The rook tries to come over to go after this, although the computer recommended just capturing another pawn. But we have this move, and here Magnus's opponent resigned. What could be played here? Rook to b8 to try and stop the pawn. Then we could have two pawns marching, and so these pawns will be unstoppable. What is recommended here? King back up to g6, c7. So now it's looking really bad. Rook over to c8, d6 is played, and the pawns are unstoppable. So even if you start marching here, we have d7, capture, and the queen. So, that is how the game could have ended. So an interesting game there where Magnus just takes it into the end game and comes out on top. And, back to what I was saying, I had a viewer ask about, well, what do you do with that knight on c3? Well, here we see Magnus ended up moving that knight to e2. So that's one of the common themes. Other games I've seen that knight just sit there on c3, helping guard the center for a long time. And once in a while, the knight, if it can't jump to b5, uh, sometimes it moves over to a4. And then if the a pawn is moved to a6, uh, there's a possibility in the future of jumping to b6, but that doesn't happen as often. So, what did Magnus do here? He can't move this knight forward. This pawn is under attack, so he retreats the knight back here, guarding, helping guard this d pawn, and allowing the c pawn to push forward and help reinforce that pawn. So that's one possibility. If you're wondering what to do with this knight on c3, where does it go from there? So I'll end up doing some more of these Jabava London games because I've had a higher number of views. So it seems like more people are interested in learning the Jabava London system. So I'll try and dig up some other examples of top players using the Jabava London system. And, it's always a good way if you're trying to learn an opening to see what the top players are doing, to give you ideas of what some of the best moves may be. All right, well, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments with whatever you'd like to discuss. If there's anything you'd like to comment on about the Jabava London, feel free. And also, thank you for watching and have a super chess day.